Gracious God, we give you thanks that you have called us together as the people of God. And through all ways and all things, that you ignite our hearts and our minds to live not just through the Word, but through our actions. And so, Lord, I give you thanks for this opportunity to grow and learn how we are growing as a body of faith, and to ask the questions that are on our hearts, and love one another throughout all of our challenges and differences. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Amen. And I'm going to invite Bill up. Bill is a ruling elder from Trinity Presbyterian Church in Clearwater. And you know, Bill, when I thought about this, doing an overview of overtures, I got that, Schoolhouse Rock kind of thing in my mind. An overture is Bill. So why don't you go ahead and explain a little bit about overtures for us?
Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
The first thing I'd like to do is ask how many folks here have been commissioners at General Assembly? We have a couple of you. How many of you are teaching elders and ruling elders? And the most important, members of the Presbyterian Church. It's always great to know who you're speaking to when you're speaking, and when I gave this information to Kathy about what I was going to talk about, I probably wasn't as clear as I wanted to be, because one of the things I did when I came back from General Assembly was to talk to my church about who we are. How do you become a commissioner in the General Assembly, and how does the process work to get all that information up to General Assembly? So what I did was before I ever went to General Assembly, I started putting together information. And I went to the Book of Order. There we go. And it says that during the General Assembly that you're supposed to have ruling elders and teaching elders. That means Ella and I are Rex. We're Rex and they're Tex. Okay, we're ruling elder commissioners and they're teaching elder commissioners. So depending on the size of your presbytery determines how many ruling elders and teaching elders you have go to General Assembly. For our presbytery, since we have under 24,000 members in our presbytery, we get 3 Rex and 3 Techs. Okay, and you always have the same amount of teaching elders as you do ruling elders. And in this case, we also had 3 females and 3 males. Everything was, all of that was pre-planned when we were selected to be the commissioners. So I'm not sure if they do that in every presbytery as far as male-female, but I do know they have to do it as ruling elders and teaching elders. So when we go to General Assembly, there are as many ruling elders as there are teaching elders. So, and one of the things about that is, with the 170 presbyteries now, we actually voted to dissolve a presbytery while we were up there. You can count the numbers and figure out how many members were in each one, and we had over 600 delegates. And then we had what we call YADs and TSADs and MADs, and these are advisory delegates. And this is something that's very unique to the Presbyterian Church. Advisory delegates are active in all our committees. When we have committee work, they actually have voice and vote. They can vote on the items that we have in committee. And we have 15 committees at General Assembly. And of those 15 committees, there's anywhere from 30-some people to 70-some people on those committees. My committee had 72 members on peacemaking. Some committees had 30, some had 40. So you can see there's a lot of folks giving out information. And one of the things, the other thing about the Presbyterian Church is everything comes up from the people. It comes up from the congregations. It goes from the congregations to the church. The church decides to put an overture to Presbytery. Presbytery decides to take that overture further and takes it up to General Assembly. So everything starts here, where we are, not from the top coming down. And I think that's most impressive in any organization, because if you've ever been in any organization, it's always from the top down. And that part of the Presbyterian Church is so impressive to me, and some of the information that we were talking about up there, I don't know whoever started it, but I remember a few years back in our own presbytery, we did the overture with Yum food, where we decided to boycott Yum Foods. And that started in this presbytery, started down in a little church in Dunedin, and went all the way up to General Assembly. So I say that to you because I'm very grateful to be in a church that's how the system works. The first 3 days we were there, we were all working in committees. The first day there were a lot of committees that were advisory committees. You could go to those meetings talking about divestment and talking about same-sex marriage and talking about, I want to say, the hot items of the General Assembly, those that were a lot of debate. So you could go to these different committees before and get some additional information. Everything was done on our computers. We have more paper up here today than we had at General Assembly. And I mean, everything was on computer. If a committee talked about something and they approved it, it went onto your computer and it said they approved it. It told you how many voted for it and how many voted against it. And it was right on your computer at the touch of a button. One of the things we found out was electronics don't always work. The very first night when we were electing our moderator, it actually came down to I think it was we had to write their names on a piece of paper, on a paper ballot, to get our moderator, because the computer didn't work. Then the electronic clickers they had didn't work. So we finally went to the paper. So, but there's always a backup. So that really showed me that they had plans made, alternate plans made, and alternates to the alternate. So they were ready for this kind of thing. So we did elect Heath Rada to be our moderator, and Heath was down in Trade Winds this last week, him and his wife, at the evangelism conference. So through all of this, what I want to say to you is the greatest thing about this church and the information that we have at General Assembly, it's not the General Assembly sending down to us, it's us bringing it up to the General Assembly. That's how it works. That's why I think the Presbyterian Church is able to look at all these issues, and when we have times where we don't agree, we have to remember it came from us. It didn't come from up here down to us. It came the other way. So that's what I want to let you know. Thank you very much. If some of the information we have, I have some handouts I will give you that I have, and I don't know what else we have up here, but I think our next speaker, who is our next speaker? That happens to be Nicole. Come on up, Nicole.
Church, and I'm delighted to be here with you all tonight. I have been asked to share with you about the committee that I was served on while at General Assembly, and that was theological issues and institutions. Part of the overture process that happens, which Bill just highlighted, is if there's an overture that comes forward and that ends up receiving committee approval and then General Assembly approval, if it changes our book of order or our book of confessions, it then goes back out to the presbyteries. And so one item that my committee considered is coming back towards our presbyteries, and that is whether or not to adopt the Confession of Belhar as one of our confessional documents within the Presbyterian Church. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about that confession, so that you might know more about it, and that perhaps if you have not had the opportunity to read it or to explore it, that indeed you might be interested in doing so. The Confession of Belhar is a confession of Christian faith that emerged out of South Africa during the years of apartheid. It's named for the city in South Africa in which it was first adopted. And it's a statement that focuses primarily around three themes: the themes of unity, the theme of reconciliation, and the theme of justice. And it was written in a church environment where racial separation made it impossible for sisters and brothers in Christ to gather together and to worship and to celebrate the sacrament of communion with one another. During our committee time, we spent a good part of at least a half a day exploring this confession, and we were privileged to have members of the Office of Theology and Worship come and introduce it to us, and so I wanted to share some of the information that they shared with us, which really helped us in our discernment process and in our conversation around this document. There were two principal authors of this document, Russell Botman and Dirkie Smith, and it was adopted originally by the Dutch Reformed Mission Church as it protested the sin of apartheid. A few years later, it became a part of Uniting Reformed Church of South Africa, the reunion of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church and the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa. So it became then a unifying document for those congregations which at one time were very much polarized and separated. It is certainly, if we adopted it, it would not be our longest confessional statement that is part of our Book of Confessions, but neither is it our shortest. And so it is not really practical for me to read it to you in its entirety, but I wanted to read you the opening statement. The confession opens with these words: "We believe in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who gathers, protects, and cares for the church through word and spirit. This God has done since the beginning of the world and will do to the end." Then the confession moves into lifting up those themes of unity, reconciliation, and justice, and closes with the most basic of Christian confessions: Jesus Christ is Lord. So one of the questions that I have been answering a lot of and have been in dialogue with folks in my own congregation since returning is the question of, well, why should the Presbyterian Church adopt this confession? And so I give you just some basic information. The Presbyterian Church states its faith and bears witness to God's grace in Jesus Christ in those creeds and confessions that make up our Book of Confessions. In these statements, the Church declares to its members as well as to the world who and what it is, what it believes, and what it resolves to do. Historically, confessions have been written as a response to particular situations. The Westminster Confession, for instance, was written specifically to address the role of the monarchy and the sovereignty of God. The Barmen Declaration, also a part of our Book of Confessions, addressed the sin of idolatry during the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the 30s. In these cases, the Presbyterian Church has made the judgment that these confessions, while written in particular times, addressing particular circumstances, help us, as the Presbyterian Church, articulate who we are, what we believe, and what we resolve to do. Only 2 of our 11 confessional statements have been written by the Presbyterian Church. Each of the others has become our confession as we have lived with it, as we have studied it, as we have used them for prayer, and as we have used them as a worship resource. The Confession of Belhar, I believe, should only become a confession of the Presbyterian Church if the Church determines that, like the others, it expresses our faith. And then it will become, through a process of time, one of our confessions, just as these other documents have. The Office of Theology and Worship has created, in part, a website and some documents which you can find which address some commonly asked questions around this confession, as well as some of their process. And as part of this document, one of the questions that they answered I wanted to share with you, and that is, why should we, as 21st century North American Presbyterians, care about this document? And the Special Committee on the Confession of Belhar, which lived with this document a lot longer than we did at General Assembly, wrote this statement. The Presbyterian Church, U.S.A. is again facing a critical time in its history. We are rent apart by division and schism. We have yet to directly confront and confess the racism that has been a significant force in our own history, and we have shown a failure of resolve to make courageous stands for justice. We believe that the Confession of Belhar, a profound statement on unity, reconciliation, and justice in the Church, comes to us as a word from God for this particular time and place for the PCUSA. We understand confession as both the Church's response to human sin and as witness to our faith. Confession by the Church is necessary because sin is present in social injustice and our conscious or unconscious participation in human suffering. Confession is not a way to cast aspersions or in any way denigrate, castigate, or delimit any person or group of persons. We, the Church, are called to confess sin because the Word of God, as revealed in and through the life of Jesus Christ and the Holy Scriptures, call us to bear witness to a just, loving, and compassionate Creator. So that committee believes indeed that this statement does just that, and that it will be a resource for American Presbyterian congregations to help us in our own conversations as we seek to be a reconciling presence in this world. So that's a little bit about the Belhar Confession. And now I'll turn it over to Joy.
I'm Joy Lockridge, and I am one of the pastors of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Dunedin. And I want to just say a few general things. First of all, this was my first General Assembly, so I had never been there. It was sort of legendary and infamous and, this big thing in my mind. And when I got there, some of my expectations were met. Some of my expectations were not. It was just different than what I expected. So it was really just an eye-opening and interesting experience for me as a first-time person. I will say Detroit was a very fine host city. I'd never been to Detroit, and the people were very friendly. Everything was just really nice. And it's obviously so much work to put something like this together and to plan it, and the Office of General Assembly, and there's a team of people that are from the host city that come together to work to kind of plan and to host you and to tell you where to go and meet you at the airport and all those things. It was all really well done, and so it's a great experience if you ever get a chance to go, just in that sense. I was on the Environmental and Immigration Issues Committee, and I am not an environmental scientist. I am not an expert on these things in any way. And I'm sure other people felt that as they got onto their committees. And one of the things that is very helpful, and Bill mentioned this, we were talking before we started, there is something called an open hearing before you vote on certain things that come up in your committee. And that's a chance for people who are speaking for or against the overture that you're talking about to just share information. So it's really helpful because you can get some information that maybe you didn't have, or get some clarity on some things that you didn't understand. And there are people that speak for it, and there are people that speak against it, so you can kind of get an understanding of what the issues and the arguments are on each side. So that was really helpful for me, and I'm sure for other people too. Another thing, just a general comment about being on the committee, I was really, one of my expectations, something that was different than I expected, I guess, was everything was just so ordinary, in the sense that the work gets done the same way. The work gets done the same way at General Assembly as it does in your church at a session meeting, or as it does at a Presbyterian meeting. You know, it was just people, Presbyterians, gathered around the table, debating, talking, trying to get the words right in the motions and the amendments. So it really was comfortable, I guess, and that was a little different than I expected. It wasn't as intimidating as I thought it might be, because, like I said, Presbyterians, you do the work the same way, no matter where you are. And I was also kind of struck by how much the youth advisory delegates participated in my committee. They contributed a lot. They contributed with questions, comments, suggestions about how to word things, and that was really nice to see the younger people really engaged and taking advantage of that opportunity that they have to be there as advisory delegates. And in the committees, the young adult advisor, the young youth advisory delegates, yeah, a lot of them are young adults, they can talk and vote, and their vote counts in the committee. When you're on the floor of the General Assembly, they can talk, which they do, but they don't have a vote, so they get to advise. So anyway, like I said, I was on the Environmental and Immigration Issues Committee, and we had 4 items that we discussed. Only one of them was really kind of newsworthy. Bill brought these things which are really helpful. You might want to take one of them. There's a little summary that came out of the Presbyterian Outlook, and then this one was put out by General Assembly, and these kind of tell you the outcome of some of the highlights. And so the only thing from my committee that made it onto these is the vote about fossil fuels and whether the U.S.A. will divest from fossil fuel companies. And so we had 4 items. 3 of them were related to the environment. 1 of them was related to immigration issues. And I'll just say, you know, each overture comes with a rationale and the reasons why this is being put forth and why we should consider it and why it's a good idea. But I would say, generally, all of the environmental issues that were before us really were motivated by a sense of our moral responsibility to be good stewards of God's creation, justice issues, you know, whether generational justice is a term, you know, whether the things that we're doing now will create a good place, whether the earth will still be a good place and people can meet their needs in the future. You know, we have an obligation to the generations coming later, and also to the poor, because many times the poor or people who are powerless don't have, they are affected by these environmental issues, but they may not have the voice or the opportunity to affect change. So those were really kind of love for God and for the creation and for neighbor, really, are the real motivations behind all the environmental things that we talked about. I'll just try to tell you the spirit of the overtures. I'm not a great detailed person, and plus there's so much information, you know, it becomes hard to absorb all the details. But this is actually the way we worked in our committee. The item that was the kind of hottest issue, or the one that was probably going to have the most debate, was the one that we saved for last in our work. So we'll do it that way too. So we had talked about, and these two things were not really so much to have the General Assembly act or to do anything except to really make a statement or to affirm this or to say that yes, we support this. So these two overtures were really more about that rather than the General Assembly taking a real action. That's probably not worded the best way, but anyway, we were affirming things with these things. So one was for the General Assembly to affirm the importance of sustainable development and the precautionary principle. Now that's something I'd never heard of before going. Some of you may have heard of precautionary principle, but that was defined for us. The precautionary principle, let's see here. I have this. Here we go. Okay. The precautionary principle is defined as the precept that an action should not be taken if the consequences are uncertain and potentially dangerous. It is the theory that an action should be taken when a problem or threat occurs, not after harm has been inflicted. It is derived from a German word meaning forecaring. So the overture was to affirm that we should be doing this. We should support the precautionary principle and sustainable development. So really all we did on this, we kind of said this is a great idea, but we asked, the committee amended it and said that we wanted to have the General Assembly appoint a committee that could kind of look into that and then prepare a study paper that would be helpful to congregations, to help people like me who don't know what the precautionary principle is, to learn and understand that, and to understand how it can be helpful, and to help congregations be able to advocate for reform. So that was the action of the committee on that. We amended it, presented it to the main body that way, and that was how the main body voted on that. They went with that amended overture. And then our other environmental issue had to do with the coal lines that they are wanting to build in the Northwest. And so it was an overture that came out of Seattle, and it was an overture to affirm the decision of civil authorities to conduct a full programmatic review and assessment of the impact of expanded coal export projects in Washington and Oregon on human health and the well-being of communities along the Northwest rail lines. And the committee basically just added some language to make that stronger and passed that, and that was also approved by the General Assembly. And the immigration item, which I'm saving the big one for last. The immigration item had to do with, and this was before all that's happened recently over the summer on the border, but there is a group of Presbyterians who are advocates for immigrants who have been connecting with each other already and have been working to try to go to the assistance of people on the borders when there are crises, and they have called themselves the Presbyterian Immigrant Defense Initiative. And this is really a group that's already connecting and working, and so the overture for the General Assembly was to ask the General Assembly to acknowledge and recognize this group, that it would become a formal group within the denomination. And they explained it to us that they will kind of operate in the way that Presbyterian disaster assistance works. When there is a natural disaster somewhere, you have a group of people who go to offer support and assistance, and this will work in a similar way. So I have not heard, but I am assuming that they have been on the borders over the summer and probably working. And the three stated purposes of the Presbyterian Immigrant Defense Initiative are to connect a community of Presbyterians engaged in direct action for just immigration reform, to deepen awareness of the injustice of current immigration policy by sharing with one another and the broader church the lived experience of Presbyterians and community partners organizing for just immigration reform at the grassroots level, and to empower Presbyterians to work to change policies and practices that infringe on the human and civil rights of immigrants in our communities, including immigrant detention, streamlined deportation, and the executing of immigration and customs enforcement by local law enforcement. So the committee we had some discussion about this, but this overture was passed also with one addition. There is a vacancy in the Office of General Assembly that they would like to have filled with someone who could be a resource for this group. So that was added to the overture. That went to the floor, and that was passed also. And then our big hot button item had to do with divesting from the fossil fuel companies. And there was a sense of urgency, and this is a detail, there was a 2%. I think the Earth can get 2 degrees hotter or something. I'm not the expert on the details, but anyway, there's a sense of urgency that we really need to do something about these carbon emissions and things that are damaging to the environment. So the overture was to have the General Assembly, to have the Board of Pensions and the Presbyterian Foundation divest from fossil fuel companies, to do that, to begin a process now and to be completely divested within 5 years. And to let the companies know that, for the state clerk to let these companies know that we have done this. And so we had these open hearings. Some of the people that were speaking for the overture were people who have worked as young adult volunteers with the Presbyterian Church in poor communities overseas. There was a girl who worked in Louisiana, and she's planting trees in areas that have been affected by the oil spill. And there was really a lot of passion. I mean, I was very touched and impressed with how much they cared about these things and how much they cared about this action passing. And we also heard from the Board of Pensions, a representative of the Board of Pensions, who was encouraging the committee to refer this overture to the Mission Responsibility Through Investment Committee. And Bill may talk about this, but there is a process in the church when it comes to our investments. If there's something that we feel is kind of out of sync with who we are, what we're supposed to be doing as Christians, the MRTI committee will engage with companies that we are invested in and ask them to change or ask them to do things differently. And divestment is usually the last resort. That's kind of the policy. After we have tried conversations and discussions at the table, if there's no response, we aren't getting anywhere, then divestment is the last response. So Board of Pensions felt that we have not gotten to that place yet, and that we're going to lose our voice if we divest immediately. That was kind of the bottom line for them, that we need to take more time and to really work on negotiations and talking. And it was pointed out that some of these fossil fuel companies are working on alternative energy ideas and projects. So, but on the other hand, the main argument against it was we don't have time. This is urgent. We need to take action now for the sake of the environment and future generations. So. This was the most debated of our issues, and it passed. The committee voted to refer it to MRTI instead of to take action and go ahead and start the process of divestment immediately. It only passed by 1 vote in our committee, and then on the floor of the General Assembly, it passed 469 to 110. And there was a minority report that came out of our committee, basically for the original overture, asking the General Assembly to go ahead and divest immediately. So the biggest takeaway for me, probably, it really was a challenge for me to think about these issues, to try to become a little more educated, and because it is important. It is important as Christians that we are good stewards of the earth, and our ability to love our neighbor, practical things that we can do for our neighbor, really are tied up in these issues. So that was something that I took away from it. So, what I have. Who's next? Oh, Ellen.
I'm next. Start with the most ones first?
Yes.
My name is Ella Banton. I'm a court session at Westminster Church in Lakeland, and I've been joy foisted off on me a committee in the presbytery. And so I've been very active in the presbytery the last few years as chair of the Committee on Preparation for Ministry. And so when they said you can apply to go to GA, I said to my husband, well, I've been doing this work without any support, and I think I'm going to want to go to General Assembly just to go. And I was totally surprised that I got to go. And it was a wonderful experience. And well, I'd like to tell you about it. I'm sure, like you, like me, you may have heard commissioners for GA say, it's boring. It's very tiring. And it's cut and dry. Well, this was not cut and dry. We all realize that. My experience did not carry out these complaints. One night, the plenary session adjourned just before midnight. That was the only time. And the lights went out. That was the break at midnight. I was halfway out of the building and I heard this big pew, and all the lights went out. And I looked over and there was my husband holding up his cell phone so I could see where he was. So we did not go that late. Jack and I went to Detroit, not the same way that everybody else did. We went via Kansas City, a little town called Jacksonville, Illinois, Indianapolis, and a lot of places in between. Only as we were traveling did I realize that it was a good preparation, as we saw pastors we had known, members of churches that Jack had served as an interim, found one of the people mourning the death of her father just 4 days before we got there. And it was just, you know, one of those things. You suddenly were connecting. And now I almost think of it that it was like a bit of a Pauline journey. You know, Paul went to Jerusalem to confer with the church fathers, and we went to Detroit to become the church fathers and mothers. And so we had a wonderful experience there. One of the things that was really exciting to me, which has nothing to do with going to GA, but on the first full day our committee was meeting, when I turned around at the morning break, I saw Charlene, I'll get back to the right thing. I saw Siobhan Starling Lewis, who had come through the Committee on Preparation here, had been ordained in a church in Oklahoma. And as we were going on break, we were said, now you're not going out to talk about business because somebody will overhear what you're talking about. But I saw her and I spent a wonderful time visiting with her. So I guess she was my mark or whatever. So it was a great experience. And there were over 600 people at the plenary. And I discovered there were only 2 people that I had known in the past. One of them was a wreck. Bob Duncan from Missouri Union Presbytery. He and I had served on a session together in Columbia, Missouri. And then here's one that we didn't even realize, and most of us don't realize. I ran into a woman who had a nice blue tag, just like we did, and she was not a missionary advisory candidate. She was a missionary commissioner. And Nancy had gone to Egypt the same time Jack and I went as volunteers, so it was another connection. And then on the Thursday morning worship, we had a young woman preach. Her name is Ann Zaki. When we knew her in Cairo, Egypt, she was still a student at Calvin College. Her father was the first Egyptian pastor we met as we went as volunteers in mission. And it was just wonderful. And then, the last day we met, there was a moderator for the General Assembly Council installed. And when I looked up and heard the woman's name, I said, oh my goodness. And I was busily texting Jack, saying, do you remember when we laid hands on Reverend Marilyn Gann in Mexico, Missouri, when she was ordained something like 15 years ago? So, the PC-U.S.A. is truly a large family. And I found it very helpful to have seen people in different stages and in different places and to understand that they were praying. And several of them continue to get my daily little emails. I was on committee number 10. We had 70 members, not 72. And the title was Civil Union and Marriage Equity. It was a hot button item. My former pastor, who retired recently, when I emailed her my committee assignment, said, well, Ella, I think it's a God thing. Well, I don't know, but I really was excited to be on this committee. There were a lot of comments and observers, and we really used our parliamentarian advisor. And if somebody says, what do we need one for? They say, have you been on the committee with 70 people yet? We have to do things decently and in order, so we needed him, and he helped us. After our committee had worked on the business of knowing each other, and I think most committees did have some time to become acquainted with each other, then we heard from the first group of people who just wanted to speak very shortly. The first person to come before us in this lineup was Reverend Dr. Mark Ottmeyer of Dubuque Seminary in Iowa. And only 20 years ago, Jack and I had heard him at a Presbyterian meeting when he spoke adamantly about the fact that no ordained Presbyterian minister should ever attend a service joining two people of the same sex in marriage. And he was quite intense about this. And so, lo and behold, 10 years later, he's the first one up, and he said who it was, and he said, I have changed my mind, and I'm going to tell you why. If you really want to know why, this is the book he has written. The Bible's, yes, to same-sex marriage. It couldn't be written by the same man that I heard the first time, but it was. And it's very helpful, and his whole comment is based on the fact that if we are making people's life torture, it can't be what Jesus intended for us to do. So, he was the first person in that line of people who only had 2 minutes to speak. And the last one was the interim pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Haines City. And he's had an entirely different view. Then we had a second group of people come before us. They represented the presbyteries that had sent the various issues that we were facing, the overtures. And they were speaking a great deal about it. And most of them were not speaking from I want to get married to my partner. That was not the issue we heard. It was, I want to be able to minister to the people who are members of my church, and they can get married in my state. And I want to be able to do it in the church. That was the issue. They had a great deal of concern about that. They were not speaking selfishly. And we also heard a lot of poignant concerns from both sides. I sat next to a man who said, you know, I'm of Scotch Presbyterian heritage. This is just not going to work for me. And then next on the other side was our youth advisory, who said, it's not going to work for me either. So at the end, I prayed with both of them. We spent a lot of time talking about these issues. There was not a mean spirit within our group. And the overture to amend the Book of Order was carefully perfected in the committee, and then he got some more. And it says, basically, that a teaching elder, where it is legally possible, may conduct a service of marriage between two persons traditionally known as a man and a woman, and that a session may allow such a service to occur in their sanctuary when the law says it can happen. The biggest perfection we kept adding to it was that no teaching elder has to perform a marriage if he feels he cannot do it. And no session has to allow it to happen in their church. The fun was somebody says, well, what if the pastor wants to do it and the session doesn't? And I made the comment to my neighbor, well, there's always a park somewhere. But this is not new that they do not have to do it. If you talk to a pastor at all, you will find that sometimes they think, I should not have said yes to after I counseled somebody. They are not ready to be married. But that is what we did and passed it. And we also passed an administrative interpretation saying the same thing. Now, have you ever heard of an authoritative interpretation? They're not very much. I found that my husband said, if you don't explain what it is, you're going to be in trouble. And I said, okay, I'll try to explain what an administrative interpretation is before I go any further. Authoritative interpretation. Most of us have never heard of it. And I went in the Book of Order, I couldn't find it anywhere. But it was explained to our committee by the moderator as well as our advisory parliamentarian that there are only two groups in the church that can give